I will call to order the meeting of the Park and Recreation Commission, our special meeting for April 14th, 2010. Let's stand for the pledge. Ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Ms. McGill, will you call roll, please?
Chair Longstreet.
Here.
Burns. Here. K-Spear.
Here.
Connor.
Here.
Wiscombe.
Here.
Larimore Hall is not present, and intern Torres Santos is not present.
Thank you. Now we will take public comment. Any member of the public may address the Commission for up to 1 minute on any subject within the jurisdiction of the Commission that is not scheduled for a public discussion before the Commission today. Seeing no one, we will move to our first and only item, Draft General Plan Update and Draft Environmental Impact Report for Plan Santa Barbara. Ms. Zachary.
Chair Longstreet and members of the Parks and Recreation Commission, we have Betty Weiss, City Planner, and Barbara Shelton, Environmental Analyst from the Community Development Department, who will be providing the presentation and assisting you with your discussion today on this item. Just as a quick background, the Parks and Recreation Commission has been involved in the Plan Santa Barbara process for a number of years. We have 2 new members, so we would understand if the learning curve is a little steeper, so feel free to ask extra questions if you feel the need. And we are at a milestone point in the process. So today we will be looking for Commission comments on the draft plan and the draft EIR, and have the Commission determine whether it actually wants to take specific action on comments this evening, or whether you would rather that staff brings it back to you in the form of a memorandum at your regular meeting, which is April 28th, to forward that to the Planning Commission. And when planning staff go over sort of the schedule, you may want to factor that into your determination. I would also like to point out we made a photocopy for you of the memorandum that you sent to the Planning Commission and the City Council in August 2008, which is specific to the policy options. That was the last major milestone for this process. Unfortunately, we neglected to send you the table that's attached to it as part of your packet. However, I did go through it, and for the most part, a lot of those recommendations are in the general plan. They just might look a little different. So I just wanted to let you know that I did a little bit of work on that end. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Weiss.
And just before Ms. Weiss starts, to our new commissioners especially, if you feel more comfortable waiting until our next meeting to form any kind of comment and recommendation, we understand that, and that might be a good idea to digest what we hear today and really be able to make thoughtful comments. So don't be afraid to say that. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Longstreet. I'll just begin with an additional comment regarding public review, commission review, and input. The draft documents were released on March 18th. And we held an open house, which I think some of you may have had opportunity to attend. And the public review period runs through till May 17th. So public comments, as well as additional questions or comments that may come to mind to any commissioner during that time period, we are certainly open to receiving your questions and comments through the entire review period to May 17th. The suggestion that well, the reason we're here today is, again, for a briefing overview and to receive any initial comments and questions you have. The Planning Commission is holding a public hearing in this room on Wednesday, the 28th. We're beginning the hearing at 9 a.m. and ending at 3 to make sure there's time for transition to your meeting, which will follow. So
we can come earlier.
You could come earlier that day if you wanted to address the Planning Commission. So those are all options, and certainly we can continue to work with the Commission and your staff to receive your input in any way that's appropriate. So I think I will back up a little bit for an overview about what Plan Santa Barbara is, the update of the general plan, what we've been doing for the last several years, why, as Ms. Zachary says, this is an important milestone point that we're back before your commission, and then focus on some of the areas we think are of most interest to you all. So in way of overview, we're going to talk briefly about the council goals that were set out for the Plan Santa Barbara process, the progress we've made to date, what the general plan framework, what is this? It's a fairly substantial body of city policy with a multitude of policy programs and direction covering a full range of important community concerns. What do we expect for the outcomes or deliverables and our overall time frame? Just a quick summary of areas where we've achieved through community dialogue general agreement, and then some important unresolved issues that are to a large degree the focus of this phase where we are. What, again, do we expect of the results of a general plan? What our analysis to date has been with a focus on alternatives, and that's really the EIR, substantial analysis of a range of alternatives. How we expect to move forward with refinements to Plan Santa Barbara, and that's an ongoing process where your input, again, is meaningful. And we're here seeking your input as well as that from other boards and commissions and the public at large. So I believe also attached to your report was a 2-page document in color. It had timeline goals. So the information I'm presenting now is really taken directly off of that little 2-page handout. These were the goals that Council adopted at the onset of the Plan Santa Barbara process. And these goals were very similar, actually, to a general plan update that the Council and community went through in the late 80s. So these have been, and this is what we find time and time again, there are core principle values and policies in this community that are, again, commonly held across the board and have really been providing great direction for protection and enhancement and appropriate future development. So the Live Within Resources goal is actually also included in the city's charter, not exactly as it's worded here, but this is a major banner commitment in the city for all planning to be cognizant of our resources and plan appropriately. Ensuring affordable housing has been a top priority for the city for decades. Providing safe and convenient transportation, that's an important issue, and many years were also spent on updating the city's circulation element, which is part of the general plan. Ensuring a strong economy, providing a base for the community in terms of vitality in our downtown commercial areas, diversity. There are a lot of interest in understanding our economy continuing to be, this commission knows too, and working with the Creeks Committee as well, having good relations with the hotel and tourism industry and all of that. Advanced regional thinking. This is something that, again, this commission is well aware of in your collaboration with the school district and others in the community, and that's something we want to keep in mind. Maintaining the unique character and desirability of the city. That means a lot of different things. It doesn't mean just design review, but for us in the planning process, we often hear about character from a design standpoint. But it's also just general livability, neighborhoods, walkability, a healthy community. Provide adequate services and facilities. Again, this is an area where, as you look through the analysis, park and recreation services, a critical public service. Encourage public involvement. This process, as you'll see, has been going on for some time with a lot of emphasis on public involvement. And then Goal 9 was actually the new one for this general plan update, which was to develop explicit environmentally sustainable policies. And in 2005, the council gave us that general direction, but we didn't quite know what we were going to do with it. And as you look at the draft general plan that's been released, we've taken sustainability as a core issue, defining the general plan as a whole. We went with that direction rather than just trying to have one sustainable element, because so many things in a sustainable system really are interrelated. So we felt it was more appropriate as an issue for the general plan as a whole. This is a review of the progress to date. Again, Council initiated the process with staff in 2005. Then we took a turn to the north, and we went and spent a year studying the Upper State Street area specifically. And then we came back in earnest in 2007, and that's when the major public outreach began. In 2008 was a year of policy development, studying development trends from the last 17 years, putting out options for what the policies would look like in the future. And I know this is a time when we came to your commission as well. So that at the end of 2008, the City Council gave us direction to move forward with a policy preferences report. And the chart that's attached to your earlier comments is referring to policies that were presented to this group in that policy preferences report. So for pretty much all of last year and a bit into this year, we've been working with staff and consultants in preparing the draft environmental impact report based primarily on that policy preferences report, as well as staff drafting and pulling together the general plan documents and related maps. So again, this is a picture of the policy preferences report, which with the date January was when we consolidated in there all the comments we'd received to date, including City Council direction. As I mentioned, this is an update of the general plan. That's how we term it, but there really are some very specific things that are happening in this process and then other elements of the general plan that will follow. So what's happening now, and one of the main reasons we embarked on this, is that Measure E, which is a section in the Charter, Section 1508, was voted on by the voters in 1989 and then codified in the municipal code, and it's also in our general plan, is a growth management program, and it focuses on non-residential growth. So you may be aware of the different categories of growth that we monitor and allocate on an annual basis: small additions to businesses, community priority allocations, or economic development allocations to bigger projects. We also have special findings in the growth management plan for protection of resources. So that had a 20-year life in the charter, and I think everyone anticipated that after this major general plan update that was done in the late 80s, early 90s, that come 2010, where we are now, is time to have an updating of the general plan. So that was a big reason behind all this. We are updating our housing element, and in the package of materials you received, the CD, the document includes within it the proposed updated housing element. Within the general plan, of course, is the land use element, which is, I think, one of the parts we'll be focusing on today are some of the policies within the land use element. We're updating our land use map. Also very interested to see if you have a chance to look at that and have questions for us on the map. And then the last bullet here is, as I've said, this general plan update lays the framework for future updates. And when you leaf through, you'll see brief new policy sections for our, hopefully someday soon, updated open space and park and recreation element, the newly created envisioned historic resources element, the circulation element. Perhaps these will just be added to that, whereas like the environmental resources element would be really a new element pulling from other existing policy. Public services and safety is an idea of a new element. We have a safety element, but this is a little bit of a new idea for that. And we'd like to have an economy and fiscal health element as well, ultimately. Here's a timeline. We met with the council in February Of course, the new council had just been seated in January, and here we are years underway on a major project. And so we wanted to brief the council on what's going on. And that was productive. They said, oh, okay, we understand you're right on the verge of releasing these documents. There's going to be extensive public comment. You should go ahead and do that. And so that's why we held this open house, and we have these hearings coming up with the Planning Commission. But I think everyone acknowledged that we needed to get back to the City Council, and we're planning a joint session of the City Council and Planning Commission so that after this public review period that we're in right now, we can receive direction to proceed. Because, again, these are substantial issues. Fortunately, a lot of areas of agreement, but some areas where the council, the upshot of that briefing we had was, we're really going to need some discussion to see where we get to as a council, where we have areas of agreement and where we may need some compromise and negotiation on some of the tougher issues. So once we have that direction in June, we set out to, by the end of the year, finalize an EIR and finalize finalize the general plan documents so they can be acted on by the City Council. So I'm mentioning these areas of general agreement. The community does feel strongly that regulating future growth is an appropriate path for us to continue on. Economic diversity and vitality, as I mentioned, living within our resources, prioritizing affordable housing, requiring smaller units. This is a land use detail that may or may not have come across your horizon, but in multi-unit development, there's been a concern about a trend of larger scale units. And the city allows multiple unit densities to be, it's higher than a duplex zone, and it's the downtown commercial mixed use, but we had no guidelines on the size of the units. And so we're completely converting our density standard from a bedroom with no size limit to an average unit size standard. And so this is actually, in general, in concept, I think we have it under the areas of agreement because it is. Some of the details in terms of what is the range of the size of the unit and what's the range of the allowed density is on the next table, which is areas that are remain unresolved. Preserving our historic and small town character, enhancing our active, healthy, and walkable community. This has been a nice addition to our general plan that we really, as planners, hadn't thought so much about. But nowadays, it's starting to become, of course, you look at how your community is designed for access to park and recreation, walkable sidewalks, the services and things that you can buy in the community. How close of access do you have to good food and farmers markets and things like that? And then, again, sustainable neighborhoods. That's an area within the land use plan that we will be looking at tonight, we think, because that's where some of your policy direction from before also went into our ideas for sustainable neighborhood planning. Some of the unresolved issues, there was a ballot measure and a vote regarding building heights, but from an overall planning and design discussion for policy, we remain concerned that the policy language be adequately vetted that we have in the general plan and that there's understanding of how building heights would be treated. The policy document is drafted, encourages looking at reduction in building heights in areas adjacent to historic resources or in areas between commercial and residential zones, like buffer areas. Density, that's what I was talking about more. With the smaller units, should there be considered more density allowed in a building? If the building size overall is acceptable, such as we might attain an understanding on floor area ratio, which is the overall size of the building, perhaps smaller units within an acceptable envelope of the building, the densities could go up. That's really one of the key land use issues that we're talking about. I think many people are looking forward to the smaller units and the smaller buildings, and then some folks also are saying, well, this is an opportunity to look for additional housing and affordable housing, still within an acceptable overall building size. Parking standards, when you look through the environmental impact report, you'll see that in addressing transportation issues and traffic congestion, parking is really very much a key issue, and the transportation planning staff has been working closely with us. We've been working with the Transportation and Circulation Committee. The Planning Commission has met jointly with them. We're meeting with the Downtown Parking Committee and the Downtown Organization, and we really we're hopeful that we'll come out with a program that can be win-win, help us manage our traffic congestion through some parking control, but also be a program that doesn't have negative effects in terms of business and the economy. Inclusionary housing is one of the policies for affordable housing, and that continues to be something that will probably carry on, not in this initial phase be resolved, but be a policy to look at in the future. And then on that note, there are a lot of policies and programs recommended here within the plan itself as well as the EIR, and one of the big issues is going to be how to prioritize those. And thinking about our times now of scarcer resources and budget conditions, of course we're going to feel constrained now, but we need to remember this is a long-term plan. And we're planning for the future, and someday one of the new programs to really hone in on the standards of what the standards should be for park and open space in a development. That may not be the very top of our priority list at the end of the year, but it will be on the list somewhere, and we need to have that long-term vision while we're doing this. So just quickly, I think I've already said this, that the outcome is the certified housing element. This will put us in a better situation in terms of the landscape for lawsuits, environmental review, and climate change. We've done, I think, a great job in our EIR and our policies to get ahead of and really be on the road of what California is asking us to do in terms of climate change. So we're hoping that with this program moving forward, we'll be in a good position, unlike other communities that have actually faced challenges from the Attorney General's office on their general plan. So with certified documents, adopted general plans, we could be in a better position to receive funding for different programs. The Planning Commission will have an updated set of policies so that they can feel confident that to evaluate new development, is this in line with our new policies? This has been a hard period of wanting new policies and trying to encourage applicants to go a certain direction when perhaps the codes are still outdated in certain areas. And overall, again, council leadership and community understanding of the vision for the future is an extremely important outcome so that we can move forward with new policies and programs. So I'm going to switch to a little bit of detail here on what we've studied in the EIR. The EIR is a program level document, and what I mean by that is if you've ever seen an environmental impact report on a project, as a project level EIR is a lot of specifics about the project and a certain amount of cumulative analysis. But this program EIR, because the project is a policy document that is wide-ranging, really looks at analyzing things community-wide and regionally at a broader level. Also, when we were working with the Planning Commission, the community over the last, in 2007 and 2008, this was one of the really important determinations. What range of growth are we going to study as potential future growth? So we came up with 4 scenarios. The Plan Santa Barbara scenario is based, again, primarily on that process in the policy preferences report. And we estimated that over 20 years, 2,795 dwelling units could be built. And we came up with that number looking at historic trends as well, and within the historic trends, little blips of where you would have more housing proposed and such. So that's the number we came up with. 2 million square feet was recommended for the commercial non-residential development, and that was looking to maintain the similar categories of development that we've had with Measure E so far. The no project alternative is something that you're required to do in CEQA so that you can analyze what's the difference between not changing your policies and changing your policies. So you want to be able to see that if you don't change anything, that will have effects and impacts as well. So you want to measure your project impacts against your no project impacts. And again, these numbers are very similar to the Plan Santa Barbara in that some development trends we expected would continue similarly as they have in the last couple decades. Lower growth was an alternative where we've heard from members of the community that they'd like to see just overall lower growth and are interested, even though the historic housing trends would tend to have you believe that maybe 2,700 units would be built, there's an interest in trying to keep that number lower somehow. And different ways of keeping that number lower would be not to change some of these density standards, for example, not to encourage housing in the downtown, not to loosen up the granny unit or second dwelling unit. And so the lower growth policy set is making less change, or if it is a change, it's a little more on the restrictive side. And likewise with the lower growth is 1 million square feet. And the idea there is that we are primarily a built-out community, and there's a concern about new commercial growth generating traffic and housing demand and such. Whereas the final alternative, the increase for additional housing, is because we've heard from a lot of people in the community that say affordable housing is one of our key issues. Let's put an alternative out there that says, how can the city build more housing? And this is also focused on the downtown areas is where the additional housing would occur. And bump up density standards, increase your inclusionary requirements, see if you can get ahead a bit of the tide of concern about the imbalance of affordable housing and jobs in our community. That's why the square footage for commercial in this alternative is also low. This policy issue termed jobs housing balance. Here, this last alternative, some members of the community and commission felt would achieve a better balance of our jobs and housing in that the commercial number is fairly low at 1 million for 20 years, and the housing number is higher than what we've historically seen. So let's see, what did these say? Overall, the range of additional growth that is being analyzed here, it's good to have this in mind, and perhaps you saw this term in the document, the next increment of growth, because this growth is, of course, on top of all the existing development that we have. And the increment of growth within this housing range is somewhere between a 5% increase to a 12%, and the increment of growth for commercial is, again, somewhere between 5% and 11%. Since we've been continually working on this, we've made some changes and refinements and added details that are all now in the general plan document. And here are some of those details. We've developed a formula for that reduced unit size standard with an average of 1,000 square feet. We identified 2 density areas for multi-unit. One is called medium-high and one is high. We've added policies within the housing element for increased densities with the smaller units and increased densities for rental housing. A concept that was discussed quite a bit in 2008 was MODA, Mobility Oriented Development Area. And it was a very specific area back in 2008, and it was shown on our land use map. Now we've converted it to principles, because what we found out was that people would just talk on and on about the mapped area, and we could never get the boundary right, and we were spending a lot of time on something that we actually felt there was a lot of agreement on the principle, so let's go with the principles and drop the discussion on the boundary. And it's been very nice for us since we did that.
So that means the principles can be applied in any area of the city that it fits, right?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. And then we've had some discussions about the historic resources element, and that would be a future separate element. We did a lot of work on the map, and again, it's in the materials we've provided. We've simplified the map in some ways. If you look at the old map, it's got a lot of little decals on it and symbols. Now we're going primarily with just the colors being the base information. The big thing is having this modernized as a GIS document and no longer a hand-drawn document. And in doing all that work, we knew about inconsistencies where what's on the ground is not, and it has been for decades, and you don't want it to change. You want Milpas to be a commercial on both sides of the street. Yet our general plan called the west side of Milpas as industrial. There's all kinds of things, and we held in our open house at the rear of the room, we made big maps, and we notified property owners about possible changes, and we've had some good discussion about that. So I'm interested in your questions on our map update. And then again, the big change for the map is the new density area in the downtown. The EIR has quite a bit of information. It's an extensive document. It's incredible in terms of pulling all of this together in one location and looking at the full range of resource concerns for our community. There are mitigations recommended in many areas, essentially all areas. If there was a significant impact, the mitigation was required to reduce the impacts. If the area might be considered adverse, there are recommended measures because, again, we wanted the feedback to improve our policy where we can. The areas that have the significant impact that can't be fully mitigated as we see it today is traffic congestion and then climate change. Those were identified as Class 1 impacts. In the memo and for today's meeting, as well as looking at your memo and communication from before, these are, as we understand it, your key areas of interest. However, if in your review of the document, again, you'd read the energy section or the section on transportation and you want to shoot us a comment maybe as an individual, we're very open to that, but today I think we're going to focus on these areas that are most in line with your Commission's purview. Land use growth management, open space and park and recreation element, the new development standards that are recommended, community benefit land uses, the sustainable neighborhood plans, and the Highway 101 setback. Those were areas that you've commented on in the past. And here's an abbreviated list of some of the policy names and numbers that we'll be referring to in your discussion today, looking at the MODA and what we anticipate in terms of appropriate provision of open space and recreation to support increased densities and new development, open space planning more on a broader open space level. Somewhat related to that is the concept of transfer of development rights, that you can preserve open space in appropriate areas that have a lot of value and then perhaps transfer development into the downtown. Community benefit land uses with limited commercial square footage, whatever number it is, 2 million, 1.5 or 1 million. We've already seen in this last 20 years that it's important to have a reserve so that when the community projects come along, the ones that you really want and need, like hospitals, airports, community centers, that we have square footage in our plan for that. Trees and landscaping, and then in the mitigation measures, recommended measures in the EIR, there's a section there on public services that talk about additional park opportunities, pocket parks and other parks. So for this evening, we'd like to hear your questions. We'll answer them if we can, but questions in general are good also. Any initial comments you have, any areas that you'd like for discussion? If you're ready today to give us any direction in terms of you concur or agree with this general direction that we're going with the general plan, what agreement or understanding you have in terms of the EIR assessment, any additional or different recommendations that you'd like to make, we're open to your input. So that's the presentation.
Thank you. Well, let's start with questions. I'm sure there are some questions, possibly, or comments on what you've read. Anybody want? Okay, Mr. Casebeer.
On the first slide, on the goals, I'm just curious what pedestrian scale, live within our resources by balancing development with available resources and promoting sustainable pedestrian scale. What is pedestrian scale?
I think for the city, pedestrian scale is, it's well defined in a document called the Urban Design Guidelines. And it is a scale of building and space. And so when we say pedestrian scale, what we mean is comfortable sidewalks where the pedestrian has sufficient space and landscaping, and then the area between on the sidewalk, between the sidewalk and the street is comfortable, and then between the sidewalk area and the built area adjacent is at a scale that's comfortable. In other words, when you look at the entrance to the courthouse, it's very grand, huge arch, and you have a better sense of pedestrian scale there because look at how long the walkway as you approach it. When you're walking down State Street, most of the commercial buildings have great pedestrian scale because at the street they're mostly one story and have storefront level entrances, and so that's pedestrian scale. So it's not just one size, but it's the overall design that we're talking about there.
So whereas the underpasses under 101 would not have great pedestrian scale.
Well, there I think it may be a
Like
matter of
Korea.
scale as well as just environmental conditions. It's a pretty rough spot to be walking because of the noise and things too. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And under the land use assumptions, and we're discussing 2,700 units or 2,000 units or 4,300 units. Over what period of time is this projected for?
Those alternatives are looking at the primary planning horizon of 20 years.
20 years.
Yes.
If we go...
Although the EIR also, or 22, I think, because we
30 is, we're looking at 2030.
okay. The EIR also includes an analysis of, it's called extended range, and we are also looking at what closer to a full build-out scenario is. But the focus of this plan is more on a 20-year level.
In order to see where we're going, do we look backwards? In other words, how many units were built in the last 20 years? Residential units. Do we have a sense of that?
Yes, we did look backwards for a trend. And then we're also thinking, trying to be open to the idea that what might we think we know about the future? So it's a little bit of a combination. That's why the range, like for example in the additional housing range, that's well beyond what our historic trends have been, which is somewhere around 100 more or less units per year built. Some years have been more, certainly. So the additional housing isn't just based on looking back, because it's projecting, over 4,000 dwelling units in a 20-year period. So that includes projecting in the future new city policies that would encourage more housing development than we've experienced in the past. Yeah.
And then in generating more affordable housing units in the downtown area, are they considering converting commercially zoned areas into residential?
That has been, again, a trend that we've seen. The zoning, it remains commercial in the downtown. It's not proposed to change in terms of, there's a few little areas to change, like I mentioned, Milpas. But our commercial zones, with the exception of the industrial area, do allow, and they have for decades, both commercial and residential. And so what we are planning for is additional housing in the downtown because it is allowed and it can be of good value in terms of land to improvement, market value to build housing. That certainly has been the experience. And also because commercial development is fairly limited. If your commercial development allowances are $1 million or whatever and you own commercial property and you really can't build a new big office building, people are interested in building the housing. So there's a lot of factors that have indicated that more housing development in our downtown is likely to be a continued trend if we want to continue to support that.
Thank you.
Please come.
Yes, the two new commissioners. I just have a couple things. The 5 key policy drivers that were discussed, one of them was public and community health, and obviously that involves walkability, bicycling, connectivity between areas. Where is that specifically transferred into the document? I kind of lost that. It didn't seem to come across in the Chapter 14 section, and it seems to be, well, I just simply couldn't find it. So,
well, it was actually hard for us. As I said, this is a little bit of a new idea, but it makes sense when you think about it in terms of your land use planning and your general plan. But we did add policy language in the both in the land use element, I think, and then in the new circulation policies. So which page is circulation on? Do you see it?
so it's Chapter 7, 317.
Let's look at page 317 of the land use element. You may not have it printed for you. Let me.
No. But those are things
That's in the housing
addressed in
element.
circulation element,
Here we are.
aren't they?
Yeah. So, again, certain elements in fostering and supporting a healthy environment do relate, again, to walking, mobility, and such. So we have some of that in the transportation section. Let me see. And then, the emphasize high-quality public right-of-way infrastructure and include pedestrian enhancements and bicycle facilities. And then in the land use section, I believe, we had...
So that was in transportation? Is
right.
That, okay.
And the new policies in the transportation. And then I recall that we developed something that said designed towards healthy community, let's see. It certainly didn't have, community, LG 12, under community design, healthy urban environment. Consider health and land use circulation and park and recreation decisions. Solicit input on opportunities for furthering the integration of health concerns into land use. So it's a fairly broad policy. This is somewhat new to us, so we're just saying let's get input and continue to plan for that. Possibly create guidelines looking at the new sustainable and energy conserving. There's also guidelines coming out about healthy communities that we could be applying some of those in Santa Barbara. I think also under community benefit land uses, again, how supportive the community has been of farmers markets. That's an example in land use in terms of supporting healthier community as well. So it wasn't a big one area. It's just in there in a few places.
I think under the sustainable neighborhood planning, there seems to be some mention of the transit and kind of walkable streets and traffic calming and all those good ones.
Yeah, the sustainable neighborhood, LG 17, that policy as a whole, when you look, if you're able to support and enhance the neighborhood in all those areas, that is building a healthier environment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that.
Barbara's reminding me, yeah, food and agriculture was something we added as well in one of the other elements, environmental element as well. And we got a few comments about that. We've never had a food policy before, but now we do.
But if you think about it, I mean, we have community gardens. That's part of, who we are, so.
Exactly, and neighborhoods that do food exchanges and, yeah. And then, would you talk a little bit about the intention, for lack of a better word, in you talk about developing sustainable neighborhood plans, and it seems to me when I was reading this that there is a lot of emphasis put within the parks and recreation components of a general plan. There's a lot of emphasis being put on sustainable neighborhood plans and local neighborhood groups that design their plans and then bring them to council for approval and implementation. And can you comment on the intentions of what's written?
Well, I think your question is covering a little bit of the intention, which is a grassroots interest. There certainly are areas of the community where the city is more proactive in planning and investing. The downtown area is clearly one. Areas all within the redevelopment plan area that we've had for so long have had goals and programs to enhance those areas. But where this came from to a large degree was grassroots interests like the Mesa group, and that's why we highlighted them as an example. But they're not the only group. There have been a couple neighborhood meetings on the Upper East Side, and they're interested in looking at what's unique and important in the Upper East and how it relates to State Street, because it's close to a commercial area and it's also close to the Mission, one of the biggest tourist attractions in our community. The Coast Village Road area has an interest in developing unique guidelines for future development in that area. So there isn't one plan fits all. What we're trying to say here is that we would be open to community interest, and we've talked about developing as a first step for implementation here somewhat of a toolkit or guide on how you might pull together neighbors and a community and start sustainable neighborhood planning. And in terms of working that with the city, that's that's an interesting thing, because I just, again, recently had this experience where Coast Village Road has gone out and they've done a lot of work, but the city really hasn't been working too closely with them. We've said, oh, great, we're encouraging that. But at some point, it becomes necessary that this really become a city project as well, so that we can become a partner and figure out what things about city services, planning, standards, do they want the city to act on, and what things about their neighborhood, sustainable neighborhood plans are really within their own decision making and their own way of life, like the food sharing and things like that. So we're encouraging, I think the intent is that it be grassroots initiated, and then it become a partnership with the city, at a time when we want to move forward with these ideas.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. I think one of the areas where I guess where we need more neighborhood parks. That's what I'm trying to say, according to these documents. And the draft says that, I believe it says that the neighborhood parks are going to be planned as part of the neighborhood plans. And I guess my concern, are there neighborhoods that might fall through the cracks because they don't have these grassroots efforts? And it's just a comment I want to make, and I think that's something that the commission should probably look at.
Right. Well, that is the within the Parks and Recreation element, where what's the city's goals? Again, broadly, community-wide, or identifying specific areas that are underserved and not just waiting for development opportunity as a way to achieve parks. And I think that really has been the city's policy when you look at the new Pocket Park addition to Bonnet Park on the west side. That was a city-initiated improvement. It involved the public, but that neighborhood didn't necessarily hold meetings like they did on the Mesa. I think so. We want to be sure to have good guidance on that, and I think we should look at the park and recreation element possibly. And Jill?
Chair Longstreet and Commissioner Wiscombe, I guess having this as a policy in the general plan would not preclude efforts to establish a new community center, the Lower West Side being a prime example that I'm sure Commissioner Case-Spear would like to talk about, and we agree with. But it is a way to identify this as being an objective or a policy of the city to allow something like this to occur. If a neighborhood wanted to create a sustainable neighborhood, what kind of components would create a sustainable neighborhood? This sort of gives you a good list of that. If there are neighborhoods that the Commission wants to comment on as needing to be identified as having a need that may not be reflected in these documents, you certainly can do that as part of this process. And it just continues to inform where we would ultimately go as well with the Parks and Recreation element.
Is there, I think probably some of the real specifics lend themselves more towards that element. And is there a plan for when we will address that element?
No, I can't really say when.
So we're going to address it here.
But that's why any comments that now is an opportunity
to put it
in.
And
that's why if you, again, I know we gave you all discs and we keep referring to page numbers, and so this might be difficult. But it is the guidance for future update of the open space and parks and recreation element in the printed documents on page 159. And there are policies in here that are encouraging, for example, OP 1.4 as part of the next recreational facilities master plan update. And then it says, and or in each sustainable neighborhood plan. So again, I think it's inclusive in park and recreation planning or in neighborhood planning. Identify all publicly owned vacant land, underutilized properties, parking lots, road right-of-ways, and assess the potential for conversion of portion of these properties for park and recreational use, such as pocket parks, neighborhood parks, et cetera. So I think we have some good policy direction there.
And
Well, in the
159.
printed version, it begins on page 159.
And I'd like to draw attention to that one bullet that says number of acres for each type of open space per increment of population appropriate for Santa Barbara. That to me is really an important nut for us to crack, because as we get back to like around 14-8 in the EIR, it gets too general to me. It'll say things like, we don't have adequate space, but we do, the next paragraph down, there's some adequate space. And we identified like the field study 15 years ago and we haven't done anything about it, because where do you add space in a built-out city? But type of space, to say we have 20.93 acres per 1,000 people, I think is the figure, is an interesting figure, but doesn't mean anything when it's Parma Park and kids live on the Lower West Side. So that's my concern, is that specificity about what we're trying to do with people. On section 14 in the EIR, where it says, about the amount and what we have and what we're lacking, is, the one page, and then when you go to the impacts, it's in the EIR, 14-8. And then you go back farther and it says, really we have adequate parkland, I guess is the term it uses. I just would like to see us be able to really talk about apples and apples and oranges, because overall it may look like we're great, but how many kids get to go up to Parma Park, or what are we really talking about? Especially that there's a table, if I could find it. And, what we would need 1.45 miles of beach. Well, we can't even do that. But those are here it is. It's on 1419. There's just, to me, when I read through it, and especially reading it in the public services and safety issues, there's a metric for police and fire. We get there in 4 minutes, we get there in 6 minutes, we do this many kind of calls. We have the 20.93 per 1,000 residents, the acres per residence. But we don't really have any measurement of what we're serving and why, or how we're serving. And I like that you have in that bullet that we need to get there. We also need to get there with a commitment of dollar amount per acre to maintain it once we get it. Because an example I'll give is street tree. To be a street tree USA, from my understanding, you have to devote $2 per capita, right? Per person, to qualify for the program. So there's something that they can measure. We need to be able to measure that. It's too airy-fairy to say we need more parkland and we need more this. What kind do we need and where do we need it and why? As our standard, if we're in a high-density area, that if we have multiple bedroom units, we need X amount of open space per bedroom. I don't know how you would measure it. But I really would like to see us pin that down. And then how we're going to get there. Is the city going to establish a fund where we take those developer funds, they're in a bank, and that we then can draw on them to purchase the property as it comes up on the market? We have to be able to do something. We can't just say it without a plan on how to do it. We've done that way too many years, and so now it's time to kind of go forward in a more mindful manner to get there. Yes.
Just just to add on, my comment is, I guess, a couple of months ago, we were at talking about Ellings Park, and we realized that we had an inadequate amount of people that had an inadequate amount of soccer fields. Yet we don't really talk about that, or if we did, I missed it. And we ought to make sure we figure out how we're going to increase that amount. And I don't know how that'll happen, but just to say that we need to do something without doing anything about it, we may 20 years from now still say, yeah, one of these days we'll get around to it.
We've been saying it the whole 15 years that I've been on the commission.
Yeah, after we did the field assessment.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think we're going, I mean, I really like the sustainability part of this. I think the document is going in the right direction. There was one, I really do think we need to look at it neighborhood by neighborhood. We can't just say overall we have this amount of space. Because I do believe the needs are very different in a neighborhood with yards than it is in a neighborhood without yards. If we're building dense studio apartments, you may not need tot lots. You may need dog parks. What's out there, and it isn't enough to have the open space to me on the site of the building because we have no control over it. It can be converted to a parking lot. It can, end up with barbecue pits or whatever. So, but I do really like where this is headed. It's with the health issues rolled into it. It makes it a much more people-oriented document to me.
Chair Longstreet, I just wanted to highlight that in the Parks and Recreation section, we did include the recommended measure from the EIR about exploring the Quimby Act. Again, that's something that we've talked quite a bit about, and you mentioned, could there be a developer fee program? Could there be consolidating funds and look to leverage those? And so we've talked about it, but it's never really been city policy. So now we're putting it out there to see, should this be the city policy? And again, that may just help move the conversation, one step forward this year.
That's where we're headed, one step forward. As long as we don't have to go the two back, we're okay.
Can I ask one question about the Quimby Act? I'm looking at policy CC 18, and I just wondered, as far as rooftop gardens, does that fit in with the Quimby Act? I know we've added the rooftop garden concept into this. If you could just give me a little info.
My understanding is that those funds are to be used for public open spaces. So a rooftop garden on the parking garage could be, but what I think we're talking about, rooftop gardens and developments wouldn't be. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with I think looking at the Quimby Act, other cities have done that and very successfully, and particularly in some of the areas where, the denser areas where we're lacking the facilities that we need. I think it could work really, really well. I'd love to see that explored.
Okay. Other comments? The one thing that struck me as I was reading through it, and this is just sort of a general comment, is, and we were looking at the needs for housing and special needs housing, is for our seniors with dementia, we end up farming our seniors, our low-income seniors, out to Santa Maria and LA right now. And I would just really like to see us be mindful of facilities for, and it's hard in this community because we don't have, land's expensive, but it's just something that I see every day. And they're going to be, that population's going to be growing, not declining, that's for sure. So, and the other one was, and I probably can't find it right now, but it's in my brain, is when we were looking at ways, connectivity and transit and everything, is looking at the high schools. They weren't specifically mentioned in that area, and just that we make sure that when we're looking at developments and things, that the high school transit, so we can get some of those parents out of the cars. Maybe the kids too, but I'm not dreaming that far. Otherwise, other comments, issues?
I guess I will at our next meeting have more comments. I just from one perspective, it's a little overwhelming to jump in on this. My wife's company worked on this for a couple of years, so she probably knows more about it than I do. But it's there's a lot going on, and I appreciate what you're doing. But I hope we don't forget about the parks as we worry about affordable housing. And it's something. There just haven't been enough people talking about it, and that's, I guess, why we're here to do that.
I wanted to make a comment, and I wanted to thank you for the years of work this has entailed. I was around during the general plan update in 1989. It was in my building. It took place in my building, and it was much briefer and not as concise as this. And I just wanted to express my thanks in the work that's gone into creating this and the years that have gone into creating this. And 20 years from now, I remember saying, 20 years, that's going to be a really long time. It happened so fast. So I just wanted to thank staff for this and the community.
Having been around for the circulation element update, I twitch every time I look at the document. Thanks. I'm glad you guys are doing it. So if there's nothing do you have anything further tonight? Maybe I'll go. Well, give it a shot. We've got them all here. This is the good time to.
I agree. I think I agree with Chair Longstreet. This is going in a great direction. I go back to the desired neighborhood qualities, and I guess I just like to see them stronger. Physical and social connectivity, open spaces infill as areas are developed, enhancement of open space, local community centers, and pedestrian-friendly environments. These are all elements that were, I think, the top priorities from public comment. And I'd like to see a stronger connection between these and the general plan in terms of, what more specifics, I guess, about how we achieve these things that the public seem to prioritize as the most important, if that's possible.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Oh, yeah. Go.
I would just like to re-emphasize my personal the importance of parkland acquisition in underserved neighborhoods. And in this time of crisis with our youth, the difficulties that the police are having keeping our community safe, it's well documented that you give kids good, healthy things to do close to their homes, these other problems that we're experiencing will go down. And so in I'm quite sure the police have a map that shows where they go, where their service calls are, and I'll bet you that these areas of concentrated crime are areas where we do not have good parks and recreation services. So I would like the Plan Santa Barbara to reflect the desire to go to these areas and invest in park acquisition.
Chair Longstreet, maybe to wrap this up a little bit for me, just in feedback now, having listened, I think what the Commission wants to do is keep your eye on these policies that they're continuing to develop and stay in as you've been discussing and as supported in the community. So that will be something that we're looking for in terms of council direction in June. I don't expect that these will be areas of a lot of debate or negotiation. Again, this is a general area of agreement that providing adequate parks and recreational service community center and how it is so important at many levels, as Commissioner Casebeer is saying. That would be the one thing. You know, you're making comments, feedback to us to enhance and think about what we're saying. Are we saying it so it's clear what our intent is, et cetera? That they stay solid in the recommended document in June. And then later, when we're talking about prioritizing, I think that'll be an important time for you all, again, to look at and you see, well, you know, the planners are saying they need to get the zoning ordinance done because, you know, that's a pretty important part of this. But there's still room, and that'll be a really important part because there's so much that people want to do to enhance the community, and seeing that there's balance. How much time do we spend on design guidelines, and how much time do we spend in developing recreation standards and fees programs and things? So I think your involvement is really going to continue to be key throughout the whole year here.
I have to agree because I think a lot of those other issues, design guidelines, et cetera, are representative of one segment of the community. And I think what you're hearing up here is our concern is another segment of the community that want a place to live and a place to play, are not building multi-million-dollar homes or having any kind of development in their life that they control. So I do think that it is sort of our charge up here that's kind of, you know, the community centers and who we represent, and we need to make sure our voices are heard. I think you're very right. And I think we need to push for these sustainable neighborhood plans. I think what you have on page 150, you know, represents the communities we all want to live in. So we need to bring that forward. I would say, though, some of the things that we set up here tonight I think are going to end up being controversial points in the connectivity, in the bicycling and pedestrian amenities that we see in our community. We have seen a bit of a tide change on our in our elected leaders and things, and those are still maybe very important to many of us, that the residents be able to have access to other areas safely. So I think, you know, I don't think it's all going to be a walk in the park. Ms. Zachary.
Chair Longstreet and Commissioners, so after tonight, just to check in with you, we can summarize your comments, questions, discussion, and bring it back on your April 28th meeting for your action to forward that to the Planning Commission and the City Council.
And just commissioners, at that point, we will have an opportunity to add to or amend that memo. So, you know, if we get it in our packet a little early, think about it. Think about if there's things you want. What else? So,
Chair Longstreet and Commissioners, if I could just add, it is overwhelming. certainly planning staff have been really involved, or at least some of them. Other city staff, including myself, sort of come in and out. And if you do have the time to, review it one more time, and you do have follow-up questions, would encourage you to forward them to us. You can certainly forward them directly to planning staff. If those questions come up between now and the 28th, and it's something we can prepare a response for you on the 28th, that would be helpful as well. We tried to focus your time on key portions of both the document and the EIR, but really, I would say the document itself is the key policy document that we will have in the future. So making sure that you don't have any remaining questions or suggestions would be really helpful as we move forward.
And I would just like to thank you all for your outreach and the openness in this process. That you really are listening to what people are saying, and thank you for doing that. I think you're coming up with a great document because of it, and I think these are important principles. So thank you. Anything else? No, with that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.